Can you believe that the oldest, most terrifyingly relevant story ever told wasn't written on papyrus, wasn't carved into Egyptian pyramids, and certainly wasn't printed on a modern press? It was baked into mud, sealed by the earth, and left waiting for millennia until the world was finally ready for the truth. This isn't just history, this is the seismic event from which all other stories were born. Prepare yourselves, because we are about to journey into the black depths of time, to Uruk, where the greatest hero humanity ever conceived walked the earth, and where death itself learned fear. A catastrophe no one saw coming, the slow, silent erosion of time, almost swallowed this epic whole. We're talking about a narrative so ancient it makes the Bible look like a morning newspaper. This story predates Abraham, Moses, Homer, and the building blocks of the Western world, yet it contains the DNA of every quest, every flood myth, and every doomed search for eternal life you've ever encountered. The stakes couldn't be higher. Knowing this story is knowing the source code of human fear. Imagine the year 1853. The dust-choked ruins of ancient Nineveh, the capital of the mighty Assyrian Empire, lay silent beneath the shifting sands of modern-day Iraq. For centuries, the earth had guarded its secrets with ferocious intensity. Then, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard, followed closely by Hormuz Rassam, began to meticulously peel back the layers of forgotten civilization. They weren't looking for a legendary hero. They were looking for bricks and statues, but what they found was a treasure vault of written despair. Deep within the ruins, they stumbled upon the shattered remnants of what was once the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, one of the most comprehensive libraries the ancient world had ever known. Picture thousands upon thousands of small, brittle clay tablets, covered edge to edge in the incomprehensible wedge marks of cuneiform script. It looked like trash, broken pieces of pottery scattered across the floor, yet each fragment was a key unlocking a forgotten universe. The discovery was chaotic, a mad dash to retrieve every shard before it crumbled into dust. They packed these pieces, labeled them with hurried notations, and shipped them back to the British Museum in London, where they sat, unread and silently screaming their history for years. They were just fragments, ancient bureaucratic records, tax receipts, and astrological omens. Or so everyone thought. The true earthquake didn't hit until 1872. A self-taught cuneiform expert named George Smith, working laboriously in the basement of the museum, began the excruciating process of piecing together the narrative puzzle. He was obsessed, tracing every single wedge, every line, trying to bridge the gaps in a language that had been dead for 2,000 years. And then, he found it. On Tablet 11, a section so perfectly preserved it sent a shockwave through the entire field of ancient history. Smith deciphered a story that was utterly familiar, yet impossibly old. It was the account of a great global deluge, a massive flood orchestrated by angry gods, survived by a single righteous man who built a massive ark to save his family and the animals of the world. Smith realized, with a dizzying clarity, that he was holding a version of the biblical flood story, but one that was thousands of years older than Genesis. He was so overwhelmed, so completely stunned by the sheer implications of this discovery, that the stories foundational to Western civilization were not unique but inherited. That the legend goes he literally ripped off his clothes and ran screaming through the halls of the British Museum. This wasn't just text. This was a primary source, a direct line to the deepest subconscious fears of humanity etched in clay 4,000 years ago. This text, the Epic of Gilgamesh, wasn't just describing a great king. It was describing a near god, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who ruled the magnificent, terrifying city of Uruk. His name was Gilgamesh, and he was a beautiful monster. Uruk, the setting for our drama, was the pinnacle of early civilization, protected by walls so immense, so perfectly constructed, that the text itself boasts they were built by the gods themselves. It was a metropolis of unparalleled wealth and power, but behind those impenetrable walls, a terrible darkness was growing, fostered by the king himself. Gilgamesh was gifted by the gods, terrifying strength, stunning beauty, and a mind sharp as obsidian. But these gifts were poisoned by an arrogance that knew no bounds. He was the ultimate tyrant, a king who didn't just rule his people, he owned them. He enforced a brutal tradition known as droit du seigneur, claiming the right to sleep with every bride in the city before her husband could touch her. Can you imagine the sheer terror, the absolute violation woven into the fabric of daily life? The young men of Uruk trembled, the elders whispered in fear, and the mothers wept in silence, knowing their daughters were forfeit to the whims of their immortal ruler. His tyranny wasn't limited to sexual power. He worked the men of Uruk to death, forcing them to labor on his colossal building projects until their bodies broke and their spirits shattered. They were slaves to his ambition, sacrificing their lives to build a legacy for a king who only cared about his own monumental ego. The oppression was suffocating, a silent scream trapped within the mighty walls he had forced them to build. The people were desperate. They prayed not for revolution, but for intervention. Their cries weren't directed at human armies. They were directed at the heavens, pleading with the great gods of the Sumerian pantheon, Anu, Enlil, Ea, to send someone, anyone, to challenge this arrogant demigod. The weight of their suffering was so immense, it finally reached the ears of the mother goddess, Aruru, the creator of mankind. And Aruru heard them. She saw the despair, the broken bodies, and the shattered families. She knew that to challenge Gilgamesh, she couldn't send a mere mortal. She needed a weapon forged of the wilderness, a creature equal to the king in strength and beauty, but opposite in spirit. She needed an antidote to the divine arrogance of Uruk. The stage was set for a divine conflict, a confrontation that would shape the destiny of the world. It was time to create the rival, the shadow, the ultimate companion who would either destroy Gilgamesh or save his soul. Out of the raw, untamed clay of the steppe, Aruru performed the ultimate act of counter-creation. She spat on her hands, mixed the divine saliva with the earth, and molded the perfect man, Enkidu, the wild man, the equal, and the impending doom of Gilgamesh's tyrannical reign. The clash was inevitable, and it would shake the foundations of existence. The great beast, Enkidu, was not born in a palace, but forged in the unforgiving crucible of the Mesopotamian steppes, a force of nature totally unaware of the gilded cages of civilization that Gilgamesh had constructed. He roamed with the gazelles, drank from the rivers with the wild cattle, his body matted with hair, serving as a terrifyingly silent protector of the animal kingdom, tearing down the traps of the hunters who dared encroach upon his domain. A living, breathing defiance against the notion of human supremacy. Meanwhile, inside the colossal, intimidating walls of Uruk, a city so advanced it seemed plucked from the future, yet so corrupted by its king, Gilgamesh was tormented by cold dread. The gods had whispered their plans into the wind, and those whispers manifested as nightmarish visions that shattered the king's sleep. Visions of a meteorite, a rival, an equal, hurtling toward his glorious yet illegitimate throne. He rushed immediately to his mother, the wise goddess Ninsun, a being of unmatched power and cosmic foresight, demanding answers, demanding to know the source of this spiritual chill that gripped his tyrannical heart, a heart usually impervious to fear. She looked upon her son, arrogant and magnificent, and confirmed the awful, unavoidable truth. A man, a powerful rival created specifically to curb his unbound power, was coming, and he would shake Uruk to its very foundations. Gilgamesh, cunning even in his mounting terror, decided that this inevitable rival must be tamed, not fought in the wilderness where his primal power was absolute and untainted by human weakness. To fight Enkidu on the steppes would be suicide, a battle against the earth itself. So the king devised a weapon far more insidious than a bronze sword. He dispatched an envoy, a simple trapper who had witnessed the frightening strength of Enkidu. But the true weapon he sent was Shamhat, the temple harlot, the dazzling, dangerous embodiment of Uruk's seductive, complex civilization and its deadly allure. This was the ancient world's greatest psychological operation, the first recorded instance of cultural warfare, to civilize the savage by introducing him brutally and thoroughly to the immense pleasures and the profound isolating pains of mankind, thereby stripping him of his divine connection to the wild. Shamhat ventured deep into the wilderness, following the trapper's frightened directions, finding Enkidu at his sacred watering hole, a primeval image of raw, untamed masculinity, entirely unaware of the fate awaiting him. For 6 days and 7 nights, a span of time so long and transformative that it changed the very nature of Enkidu's being, she initiated him into the intense rites of man, forging a connection so deep it severed his connection to the animal world forever. When Enkidu finally stood up, his innocence was irrevocably stripped away. His brute animal strength diminished, but in its place blossomed the dangerous, exhilarating spark of consciousness, a terrifyingly new awareness of self, and a devastating realization of his own humanity. The wild beasts, his former companions, now turned and shunned him, sensing the unforgivable taint of civilization, the musk of Uruk, and retreated, leaving Enkidu utterly alone, filled with a newfound, terrifying yearning for the city and the arrogant man who ruled it, a yearning that drove him toward his destiny. Enkidu, now clothed in human garments and speaking the complex, treacherous language of Uruk, made his way toward the massive, impossible walls of the city, drawn by the horrific stories of the tyrannical king who claimed the ancient, appalling right of the first night over all new brides, the final, intolerable insult that ignited the full, righteous rage in the heart of the newly humanized man. He marched through the crowded, chaotic streets, his immense, wild presence causing an immediate riot, a physical manifestation of chaos and destiny walking deliberately toward the palace gate, seeking out the one man who needed to be humbled and broken. Gilgamesh, already informed by his vivid dreams and the terrified whispers of the palace guards, waited in the grand square, a thin, cruel smirk playing upon his perfect, magnificent lips, ready to meet his fate head-on. The confrontation was an immediate, terrifying physical earthquake, a cosmic collision between two forces of nature tragically dressed in human skin, two souls meant to either destroy or complete each other. They met in the city square, blocking the desperate procession of a terrified bride, and immediately locked in a grapple so devastating it tore up the very paving stones of Uruk, throwing clouds of dust and debris into the sky, obscuring the judgment of the very gods who watched from above. It was not merely a fight between two men. It was the titanic struggle of complex civilization versus pure nature, fate versus free will, the raw, brutal power of the steppes against the refined, brutal strength of the God King, a battle lasting until utter exhaustion began to set in, but neither warrior would yield an inch. Finally, Gilgamesh, utilizing his last reserve of godly lineage and his superior training, managed to throw Enkidu, driving him violently to his knees. But the victory was breathtakingly momentary, a flash of supremacy that instantly faded. Enkidu, though momentarily defeated, had met his equal, his mirror, his glorious opposite. He looked up, not with hatred or resentment, but with a sudden, overwhelming and life-altering respect for the king who could truly match his staggering primal strength and survive the encounter. Gilgamesh, for the very first time in his long, cruel life, felt the true, overwhelming surge of genuine admiration, the recognition of a soul twin, a terrifyingly perfect reflection of his own power and potential. In that world-shattering instant, the fierce rivalry evaporated entirely, replaced by the most powerful, profound bond known to the ancient world, unbreakable, eternal brotherhood, forged in blood and dust. The tyrannical king was saved, not by the judgment of the gods who had tried desperately to punish him, but by the unexpected, profound love of the very man they had sent to destroy him and bring his reign to an end. Gilgamesh lifted Enkidu up from the shattered pavement, and they embraced, their union signaling the immediate end of Gilgamesh's solitary, selfish tyranny and the dramatic, thrilling beginning of the world's first and greatest buddy adventure story, forever changing the trajectory of mythological history. But a change of heart and the embrace of a new brother were not enough to appease the wrathful gods, and boredom was the immediate, greatest enemy of the newly formed dynamic duo, threatening to turn their immense energy inward. They needed glory, they needed validation, and they needed to make their names resonate across the infinite sands of time, securing their legacy against the inevitable march of oblivion. Gilgamesh proposed a quest so terrifying, so impossibly dangerous, that it would prove their strength to the heavens and secure their immortal fame. They would travel to the forbidden, sacred cedar forest, guarded by the monstrous, flame-breathing giant Humbaba, the terrifying guardian appointed by the god Enlil, and they would cut down the sacred trees of the gods, bringing them back as trophies. The quest for immortality had begun. They stood at the precipice of the unknown, staring into the impenetrable darkness of the cedar forest, a realm so sacred, so utterly forbidden, that mere mortal entry was an act of cosmic treason. Gilgamesh, the magnificent tyrant, felt his blood surge with the thrill of sacrilege, but Enkidu, the man molded from earth and wisdom, felt a cold dread settle deep in his gut. He knew the cost of defying the gods' appointed watchmen. Humbaba was not merely a monster, he was the living, breathing essence of divine terror, given his marching orders by the mighty storm god Enlil himself. His roar was a flood, his breath was fire, and his face shifted constantly, cycling through 7 terrifying, unique auras of destruction. To walk into his domain was to walk into a celestial furnace, and Enkidu tried desperately, one last time, to pull his friend back from the brink of fatal glory. But Gilgamesh was deafened by the siren song of his own legend. He saw not the wrath of Enlil, but only the towering cedar trunks, perfect trophies to immortalize his name on the walls of Uruk, trophies that would make the city shine brighter than any star in the night sky. The sheer arrogance of the act was breathtaking, a declaration of war against the established divine order. They plunged into the darkness, the sound of their axes echoing like thunder in the ancient wood, announcing their presence with shocking hubris. The forest, silent for millennia, erupted in fury, the sound of the wind whipping through the cedars, turning instantly into the sound of Humbaba's approach. The ground trembled beneath his massive, crushing tread, splitting the earth into fissures. The air grew thick and poisonous with his scorching breath, a stench of corruption and fear that threatened to suffocate both heroes instantly, stripping the strength from their very bones. The battle that followed was not merely physical, it was a duel between mortal ambition and divine mandate, a struggle for the very soul of the forest. Gilgamesh wielded his bronze axe, the might of Uruk, its edge glowing with the heat of the conflict, while Enkidu moved with the feral brace of a mountain lion, circling the gigantic guardian, searching desperately for a weakness in its 7 shimmering coats of terror. Each aura provided Humbaba with a different, specialized power, one for blinding, one for crushing, one for poisoning, making him effectively invincible to any single tactic. It was a dance of death, lasting for what felt like an eternity. Cedar trees falling like broken matches around them, their splintered bodies raining down like arrows. The world tilting violently on its axis as the colossal monster fought for his life and his charge. Just as their strength began to wane, just as Humbaba prepared to unleash his final crushing aura, they cried out to the heavens, not to Enlil, who had sent the beast, but to the benevolent light of Shamash. And the heavens answered, not through Enlil, the furious god who commanded this guard, but through the compassionate, radiant power of Shamash, the sun god, patron of Gilgamesh's lineage. Shamash, seeing his favorite hero flagging, unleashed 13 great winds, winds of scorching desert heat, winds of freezing mountain ice, blinding dust, and relentless storms, all focused like celestial artillery directly onto Humbaba. The mighty guardian was instantly disoriented, his 7 auras of defense shattered, his overwhelming power momentarily neutralized by the sheer force of the divine solar gale. Humbaba stumbled, falling to his knees, utterly helpless, and in that moment he ceased being the terrifying engine of destruction and became, simply, a captive. He lowered his gigantic head and began to beg. He pleaded with Gilgamesh, offering to become his loyal slave, promising to cut the finest wood and serve him eternally, recognizing the king's undeniable power and the mercy of Shamash. For a split second, Gilgamesh hesitated. Could he truly kill a sentient being, broken and pleading, even if it was a divine guardian? This was the ethical pivot of the entire epic, the moment where the line between hero and villain blurred beyond recognition. But Enkidu, driven by the ruthless logic of survival and the need to cement their legend with blood, roared a chilling command. "Strike him down, my friend. If you show him mercy, his curse will cling to us forever. You must sever the head, or the gods will know we were weak, Enkidu demanded, his eyes blazing with fierce urgency, refusing to allow pity to undo their immense effort. Gilgamesh, overwhelmed by his partner's primal instruction and the heady rush of victory, lifted his immense axe high above his head. With one devastating, history-altering blow, he brought the legendary guardian of the cedar forest crashing down. Humbaba's massive body slumped to the forest floor, and as the life left his divine frame, he unleashed a final blood-curdling curse upon both heroes, a promise of short lives and eternal pain, a vow that Enkidu would never know the peace of old age. They had succeeded. They had slain the unbeatable monster, cutting down the forbidden cedar trees and rafting them down the Euphrates back to Uruk, a fleet of illegal, colossal timber that dwarfed anything the city had ever seen. They had achieved the impossible, reaching the absolute zenith of mortal glory. But the triumph was hollow, poisoned by the dying breath of the guardian. Gilgamesh and Enkidu returned to Uruk not just as heroes, but as living, breathing gods in the eyes of the populace. The entire city poured out to celebrate their return, marveling at the sheer scale of the cedar timbers and the terrifying, preserved head of Humbaba, now mounted as a gruesome trophy above the city gate. Gilgamesh, exhausted yet triumphant, bathed, polished his magnificent armor, and donned his royal robes, gleaming like the sun itself, radiating a power that challenged the heavens. It was this very spectacle, this breathtaking display of human power and divine beauty, that caught the eye of the most dangerous force in the Mesopotamian cosmos, the goddess Ishtar. Ishtar, the capricious, terrifying lady of love, war, and fertility, saw Gilgamesh and immediately desired him, not just as a lover, but as a prize, a trophy, a toy to possess and eventually discard in a fit of pique. This goddess was a vortex of passion, known throughout history for her devastating temper and her utter ruthlessness toward any mortal who dared to spurn her affections, a walking catastrophe waiting to happen. She descended from the glittering heavens, appearing before Gilgamesh in all her impossible, dazzling glory. She offered him unimaginable power, chariots of lapis lazuli drawn by storm demons, palaces of gold, and eternal glory. She offered him everything a man could desire, if he would only consent to become her husband, her consort, her momentary obsession. Gilgamesh, having just slain a divine guardian and defied Enlil, was now faced with the ultimate test of his arrogance. Could he reject the most beautiful, volatile goddess in the Sumerian pantheon? The consequences for saying no would make the wrath of Humbaba look like a gentle whisper. He looked at Ishtar, and he decided to tell her precisely what he thought of her terrifying track record, detailing her endless list of murdered and mutilated former lovers. And that, my friends, was arguably the single most catastrophic mistake Gilgamesh ever made. Gilgamesh thought his words were clever, a legendary mic drop delivered to the most beautiful, most dangerous entity in the entire ancient universe. He had detailed her crimes, the castration of the gardener Ishulanu, the transformation of the shepherd Tammuz, the endless list of broken bodies she left scattered across the Mesopotamian plains. He had effectively called the goddess of love and war a toxic, obsessive monster, and he did it right to her face. But you do not insult Ishtar, the fearsome queen of heaven, and simply walk away unscathed. The air around Uruk, which had only moments before been thick with the scent of jasmine and the pheromones of divine lust, suddenly turned acrid and cold. Her beautiful lips twisted into a snarl that would make the fiercest lioness flee, and her eyes, once pools of seductive fire, now blazed with the white-hot fury of 1,000 supernova explosions ready to detonate. Without a single word of response, she vanished from Uruk, leaving Gilgamesh and Enkidu momentarily triumphant, though already feeling the cold dread of inevitable doom creep up their spines. Ishtar ascended straight to the highest pantheon, to the ethereal palace where her father, Anu, the ultimate sky god, the king of kings, the absolute supreme authority of the cosmos, sat on his throne. She burst into the celestial chambers, not requesting, but demanding justice for the mortal's unbelievable insolence. "Father," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the cosmic rafters, "that filthy, self-important mortal, Gilgamesh, has shamed me. He has rejected my hand and slandered my name in front of his dirty commoners. I demand satisfaction. I demand you release the bull of heaven to trample Uruk into the dust." Now, this bull of heaven was not just some farm animal, understand. This was a creature of world-ending power, a physical manifestation of drought, famine, and destruction, capable of laying waste to entire civilizations with a single snort. Anu, though usually placid and stern, understood the implications of releasing such a beast onto the mortal realm, especially just for a minor slight against his daughter's pride. "Daughter," Anu cautioned, his voice the deep, rumbling sound of distant thunder, "if I grant you the bull of heaven, Uruk will be consumed. And not just Uruk, its power will unleash 7 years of devastating famine across the entire land of Sumer. Have you considered the cost?" Ishtar, however, was past reason. She was a goddess scorned, and a goddess scorned is perhaps the most dangerous force imaginable in any mythology ever. "If you do not give me the bull," she hissed, leaning closer, her beautiful face now utterly terrifying, "I swear by the ancient oaths of heaven and earth, I will shatter the gates of the underworld. I will turn the dust into the flesh of the dead. I will make the dead rise up and devour the living until the number of the dead surpasses the number of the living." The threat was immediate, it was horrifying, and it was undeniably effective. Anu knew she possessed the power and the sheer unbridled madness to follow through on this ultimate celestial threat, an ancient Mesopotamian zombie apocalypse designed purely for vengeance. Faced with the choice between a targeted 7-year drought and the utter collapse of the natural order separating life and death, Anu reluctantly gave the command. The bull of heaven descended from the celestial spheres, a terrifying mountain of muscle and horn, radiating heat and fury as it plummeted toward Uruk. When it landed, the impact was so great that the entire city shook, the walls of the great temple complex rattling like children's toys. It roared, and the breath of that roar instantly created massive sinkholes in the earth, swallowing hundreds of unfortunate souls whole. But this was the moment the ancient gods should have remembered exactly who they were dealing with. This was Gilgamesh, the 2/3 divine king, and his wild, untamed brother Enkidu, now standing side by side, united in lethal purpose against the very forces of nature in the heavens. This was the hero, facing the true impossible test, the ultimate manifestation of divine fury. Gilgamesh, wielding his massive bronze axe, stepped forward, while Enkidu, the man of the wilderness, darted around the bull's gigantic flanks, distracting it with unmatched speed and agility. Enkidu was the master tactician, using his deep understanding of nature's beasts to find the single point of vulnerability in this divine monstrosity which the bull itself was desperately trying to conceal. The battle was epic, lasting hours, filled with the thunder of hooves, the crunch of stone, and the terrifying screams of the dying. Finally, seeing his opening, Enkidu vaulted onto the bull's back, grabbing the colossal beast by the horns, holding its monstrous head still just long enough for Gilgamesh to deliver the blow. With a mighty swing that would echo throughout 10,000 years of human history, Gilgamesh buried his sword, the Might of Uruk, deep into the back of the bull's neck, severing the colossal spinal column. The sheer scale of the hubris displayed by these two kings, one human, one sculpted from clay, was an offense so profound it threatened the very balance of the Mesopotamian cosmos, a violation that demanded payment in the most agonizing currency imaginable. The gods convened, a council of thunder and ancient malice, their voices echoing in the highest heavens above the smoke and splendor of Uruk. Anu, the Sky Father, stood silent, but Ishtar, still burning with the humiliation of her rejection and the slaughter of the bull of heaven, screamed for justice. Enlil, the Lord of the Air, the traditional enemy of mankind, cast the deciding final vote. Enkidu would be taken, sacrificed to restore the fractured divine order. One morning, as the relentless sun baked the monumental walls of Uruk, Enkidu awoke not with the rugged strength of a mountain warrior, but with the chilling, paralyzing fever of a divine curse. His body, once the pinnacle of sculpted perfection and savage power, became a terrifying prison of searing pain, his muscles failing, his breath catching like a trapped, panicked bird. Gilgamesh, the man who had faced down primordial monsters and stared down armies, stood utterly helpless at the foot of his friend's deathbed. He bellowed at the heavens, demanding an answer, threatening the gods themselves, forgetting for a terrible moment that they held the ultimate, inescapable power over life and death. He summoned the greatest priests of Sumeria, men who specialized in banishing demons and interpreting the will of the stars, but their ancient magic was useless against a sickness delivered by the highest deities. This was not a natural disease. This was divine cancellation, an unappealable judgment written in the stars and delivered by the air itself. As the fever raged, Enkidu began to rail against his own fate, his mind fractured by pain and vivid, terrifying nightmares. He cursed the hunter who first found him, the harlot Shamhat who had pulled him from the blissful ignorance of the fields and taught him the painful, complicated ways of man, arguing fiercely that knowledge and civilization had only led him to this agonizing, pointless end. He lamented the loss of his savage freedom, the days when he ran wild with the gazelles, untouched by the complexity and the ultimate cruelty of the civilized world. He cried out in his delirium that ignorance had been true bliss, and the price of brotherhood with a demigod was this unbearable torment, this slow, humiliating dissolution. Then the true, soul-shattering terror began, the vision. As life slowly drained out, the veil between the world of the living and the dreaded land of no return, the dark Kernugi, was violently ripped open, granting him a glimpse of the absolute finality that awaited them both. Enkidu described to his horrified friend a bleak, lightless landscape, a sprawling house of dust where the forgotten dead wore grotesque feathers like birds and lived in eternal, suffocating darkness, their only horrifying sustenance the dirt they ate. He saw the ghosts of former kings and high priests, all reduced to the same pitiful, powerless state as the lowest slave, serving the terrifying, unblinking Queen Ereshkigal, the Lady of the Great Earth. It was a place of suffocating silence, of absolute cold finality, a vision so stark and devastating that it stole the very air from Gilgamesh's lungs, injecting the first true, paralyzing dose of fear into his divine heart. For 12 agonizing, endless days, Enkidu fought the inevitable, struggling against the celestial death sentence. Gilgamesh never left his side, holding his friend's hand, whispering promises of vengeance and immortality that he suddenly knew he could not keep. On the 12th night, with a final, rattling, gasping sigh, the life force left Enkidu's once powerful body, escaping into the oppressive night air. The silence that followed was louder, heavier, and more absolute than any thunder ever conceived. Gilgamesh watched, frozen in a state of deep shock, as the man who was truly half of his own soul became a cold, unresponsive, rapidly cooling shell. The King of Uruk, the magnificent, unstoppable hero, was utterly and irrevocably broken. He refused to accept it, falling into a frantic state of denial. For 7 days and 7 nights, Gilgamesh sat rigidly beside the corpse of his friend, talking to him, commanding him to wake up, desperately believing that somehow the sheer unparalleled force of his kingly will and his 2/3 divine nature could reverse the decree of the gods and overturn the natural order of decay. He watched relentlessly for any sign of breath, a faint flicker of movement, any divine intervention that would cheat death, until finally, tragically, a small, pale worm crawled out of Enkidu's nose. That single horrific crawling moment shattered the last shard of Gilgamesh's desperate denial. The worm was the undeniable messenger of absolute truth. Gilgamesh let out a roar of primal, unimaginable grief that shook the very foundations of the immense palace. He violently tore off his magnificent royal robes, the stunning finery of the King of Uruk, and replaced them with the filthy, rugged pelk of a lion, symbolizing his immediate, frantic descent back into the wild, savage state from which Enkidu had once gloriously emerged. He realized with crushing, unbearable clarity that this exact same disgusting fate awaited him. If Enkidu, a warrior blessed and sculpted by the gods, could be reduced to dust and the sustenance of worms, then the 2/3 divine King of Uruk was also terrifyingly vulnerable to the same cold fate. The shadow of death, once an abstract, distant concept reserved for commoners and enemies, now stalked him in broad daylight, breathing down his neck. The arrogance was instantly replaced by an all-consuming, paralyzing, existential terror. He had successfully defied the gods, he had murdered monsters, but he could not stop the one ultimate enemy that defeats all things, the inevitable process of final decay. Gilgamesh buried his friend with magnificent, unprecedented honors, a spectacle of gold and lapis lazuli befitting the greatest warrior on earth. But the true funerary ritual was the fierce oath he swore over the tomb. He would not die. He would embark on a desperate, suicidal quest to find the one man who had survived the Great Flood, the immortal Utnapishtim, and steal the secret of eternal life itself by any means necessary. The greatest, most desperate journey in recorded human history was about to begin, fueled not by glory, but by paralyzing, desperate, absolute fear of the worm. The shock of Enkidu's death had pulverized Gilgamesh's kingly arrogance, leaving behind a husk draped in the skin of a lion, a symbol of his new wild desperation. The golden robes were gone, the mighty city of Uruk abandoned to its own fate. Now there was only the desert wind and the gnawing certainty that the grave awaited him, just as it had awaited his brother. He ran, not toward a goal, but away from the inescapable shadow that loomed larger than any mountain, a flight of terror across a landscape that actively tried to kill him at every turn. This was not a royal expedition with chariots and fanfare. This was a frantic, primal scramble, a desperate man battling internal demons and external heat, traversing the searing plains and climbing the jagged, unforgiving slopes. He wept, he stumbled, and he wrestled with the realization that all his strength, all his tyrant power, meant absolutely nothing when facing the ultimate executioner of time. Every drop of sweat, every torn muscle fiber, was a testament to a fear so profound it superseded pain. He was driven by the phantom image of Enkidu's decaying face, a terrifying vision that fueled his steps even as his own body failed him, pushing him toward the literal edge of the known world. His destination, if such a frenzied chase could be called a destination, was the terrifying, unimaginable twin peaks of Mount Mashu. These mountains were not merely high geography. They were the very barriers that held the sky in place, the place where the sun god Shamash rose and set, the literal gate to the afterlife and the forgotten secrets of creation. Days blurred into weeks as he ascended the unforgiving mountain, his feet bleeding against the basalt and shale, becoming less of a man and more of a starving, obsessed beast. He was intent on crossing the threshold, determined to find Utnapishtim, the only mortal survivor of the Great Flood and the possessor of eternal life. And then he found it, the gate. But guarding this entrance to the darkest secret of the cosmos was a terror far greater than any beast he had slain in the cedar forest, the scorpion men. Half human, half scorpion, their sheer presence radiated death, their terrifying aura enough to instantly melt the will of any mortal man who approached too closely. Their gaze could vaporize mountains, their sting could poison the very air, and their duty was singular, to prevent any living soul from setting foot in the black path of the sun, the pathway of night. Even the mighty Gilgamesh, the king who feared no living creature, felt his knees buckle and his heart seize within his chest under their horrifying scrutiny. The scorpion man's wife, equally terrifying, stood beside him, and for the first time since the passing of Enkidu, Gilgamesh experienced a fear that transcended the fear of death, the paralyzing, absolute fear of divine annihilation. He somehow managed to speak, his voice a dry croak, explaining his lineage, his power, and the unimaginable suffering that had driven him here, chasing the secret of Utnapishtim, the immortal survivor of the god's wrath. The scorpion man looked down upon the pathetic figure, acknowledging his royal blood, but pitying his foolish mortal quest. "No mortal man has ever passed this gate and returned," the guardian boomed, his voice like grinding stone, resonating with the sound of universal judgment. "The passage is 12 leagues of absolute, suffocating darkness. You will travel with the sun god Shamash, but he travels at the speed of light. If you hesitate for a single second, the darkness will consume you whole and grind your bones to dust." It was a challenge that promised certain destruction, a guaranteed oblivion, but Gilgamesh had already accepted death the moment Enkidu took his last breath. He told the guardians that his life was already forfeit, that he must walk this path or endure the greater death of meaningless, temporary existence. The massive, obsidian gates swung inward with a dreadful, ancient sound, revealing a chasm of night so profound that it seemed to absorb light itself, draining the color from the world outside the entrance. This was the road that Shamash, the sun god, traversed every night to reach the dawn, a journey of 12 double hours or leagues where no light penetrated and no sound survived. Gilgamesh stepped into the void, and instantly the world ceased to exist. He couldn't see his own hand inches from his face. The air was thick and cold, pressing down on him, and the silence was so perfect it became a high-pitched, maddening scream in his ears, ripping apart his sanity. He walked the first league powered purely by adrenaline, screaming Enkidu's name into the suffocating abyss, hoping the sound would somehow anchor him to reality. The second league brought blinding disorientation. He fought the urge to stop, to curl up and let the eternal night claim him and his quest. He stumbled into the third, realizing that the darkness was not just an absence of light, but an active, malicious entity intent on driving him mad, trying to pull the core of his soul from his body. Time dissolved. Was he walking for minutes or for centuries? The sun god was far ahead, moving relentlessly, and Gilgamesh was merely an infinitesimal speck struggling against the universal current. By the sixth league, the absolute halfway point, he was hallucinating, battling phantom demons, and hearing the mocking laughter of the forgotten dead, the shades of the underworld reaching for him. His muscles screamed, his mind fractured, and he knew he was crossing the boundary between life and the land of the shades, paying the ultimate price for his desperate desire. His final push, Leagues 10, 11, and 12, was executed entirely on muscle memory and the burning, toxic core of his terror. He pushed through the sheer exhaustion, driven by the absolute necessity of finding Utnapishtim, the only man who had ever defeated the worm and lived to tell the tale. Just as he was certain he would collapse and become a permanent fixture in the cosmic night, he saw it, a faint glimmer, a pinprick of glorious, blinding light, the tail end of the sun's journey escaping the chasm. He lunged toward it with the last reserves of his dying strength, bursting out of the tunnel and collapsing onto warm, soft ground, gasping for the air of the living world. He was safe, but the world he emerged into was nothing like Uruk, nothing like Mashu, nothing like any mortal realm. He had stepped out onto the shore of a primordial sea, a place of impossible, breathtaking beauty, where the very trees bore precious jewels instead of fruit. This was the Garden of the Gods, a place where lapis lazuli dripped from the leaves, and carnelian stones hung heavy on the branches, shimmering in the eternal twilight, a paradise forged by divine hands. But Gilgamesh, covered in dust, fear, and the residual terror of the tomb, could only see it as another cruel, mocking obstacle. He was still mortal, still dying, still running from the grave, and this heavenly landscape only emphasized the immense, horrifying distance between his temporary, fading existence and the permanence of the divine. He knew he was incredibly close to his goal, but he was also more alone than he had ever been in his entire tyrannical life. The mighty King Gilgamesh, who had once embodied the very definition of unyielding divine power, now stood utterly broken by the sight of his best friend's lifeless body. His grief was not the silent, dignified sorrow of a monarch. It was the visceral, animalistic terror of a man watching his own future self decompose. The fear was a physical ailment, worse than any poison, rotting him from the inside out. He did not just mourn Enkidu, he became him. He ripped off the royal linen, the ceremonial gold, the signifiers of his temporary earthly glory, replacing them with the stench and filth of the ragged lion skin Enkidu had worn in the wilds. Gilgamesh let his hair tangle into knots, his beard become matted, abandoning all semblance of the civilized king he had once been. He was no longer the perfect builder of walls. He was a savage running from the funeral pyre that, to his terrified eyes, was burning the very concept of mortality into existence. The beautiful, secure walls of Uruk, the magnificent ziggurats he had perfected, suddenly felt like the perfectly constructed walls of his own future tomb. Every brick screamed of his impending doom. The king, who had faced down primordial beasts and insulted the greatest deities, now looked into the reflecting pool of the Euphrates and saw nothing but vulnerable, perishable flesh. His power meant absolutely nothing in the face of the ultimate final deadline. He fled the city that defined his tyranny and his genius, disappearing into the vast, howling silence of the great Cedar wilderness, propelled by the corrosive acid of pure, agonizing fear. He was running toward a ghost, seeking the one man who had successfully cheated the darkness, Utnapishtim. The path to Utnapishtim was not merely long, it was metaphysically impossible, requiring him to cross the boundary between the mortal earth and the cosmic realm of the gods. The first barrier was the terrifying, twin-peaked monstrosity known as the Mashu Mountains. These peaks were not just high geographical features. They were the very gates of creation and destruction, the exact point where the sun god Shamash entered and exited the world, traversing the terrifying abyss beneath the earth. And guarding this celestial border, this absolute threshold of life and death, were creatures of pure mythological dread, the dreaded scorpion men. Half human, half scorpion, these were beings whose existence was defined by the cold finality of the grave itself. Their armor gleamed with infernal light, their gaze was said to instantly induce death, and their tails dripped with venom capable of stopping the hearts of giants. When Gilgamesh, now reduced to a starving, filth-covered vagabond, approached the gate, the great scorpion man looked upon him. He did not see a king. He saw a creature already touched by the decay of mortality, a man who had traded his crown for the smell of the grave. The scorpion man, a being of utter cosmic detachment, recognized the quality of the king's sheer, unstoppable terror. The guardian delivered a warning that echoed like the final hammer blow upon a coffin. No mortal has ever passed through this mountain, King of Uruk. It was a road built for the swift, eternal movement of the gods, paved by starlight and defined by the absolute absence of life-giving warmth. Yet Gilgamesh, fueled by the horrifying, indelible image of the worm crawling from Enkidu's nose, plunged into the black maw of the mountain tunnel. 12 leagues. 12 leagues of absolute suffocating darkness, where the very air was cold and dead, and the sense of self began to dissolve. This was not mere nighttime. This was the road of Shamash after his descent, the terrifying void between worlds. The king walked for hours, feeling the crushing geological weight of the earth above him, losing all sense of direction, time, and sanity. Imagine the profound psychological horror, the pinnacle of human civilization, the great tyrant of Uruk, crawling blind through the bowels of the earth, fighting the urge to simply surrender to the overwhelming, eternal void. Every agonizing step was a desperate battle against the terrifying knowledge that he might have already died, and this lightless corridor was his eternal, freezing purgatory. He had to keep moving, driven by the chilling knowledge that if the sun god caught up to him, the sheer, unimaginable heat would instantly vaporize his mortal flesh and bones. After what felt like an eternity, exactly 12 agonizing hours later, just as the sun was about to burst forth, Gilgamesh staggered out. He emerged, gasping and skeletal, into a terrifying, crystalline garden of the gods, a place so perfect it felt like a cosmic trap. There, jewels hung like shimmering, impossible fruit from the trees. Lapis lazuli leaves, carnelian fruit, and shimmering onyx stones covered the ground, reflecting light that felt alien and cold. And there, tending to this impossible, silent paradise, was Cedar, the divine alewife, the veiled goddess who ran the tavern at the very edge of the world. She saw this filthy, trembling creature approaching, and her first instinct was not to welcome him, but to lock her doors against him. She had never witnessed such a visceral manifestation of pure, unadulterated human misery and panic. This was a king who had devolved into a feral animal, and her fear was the ultimate, horrifying insult to his former majesty. Gilgamesh, driven to the screaming brink of desperation, roared at her, demanding the path to Utnapishtim, recounting his epic grief and his absolute, debilitating terror of death. Cedar, the voice of cosmic reason and the ultimate acceptance of fate, offered him the most profound, devastating wisdom in the entire epic, the brutal, beautiful truth of mortality that he desperately refused to accept. Gilgamesh, she cautioned him, her voice like distant chimes of fate, why do you pursue the life which you will never find? When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to man, but life they retained in their own keeping. It was the absolute, final rejection of his quest, delivered with agonizing, divine tenderness. She told him, in essence, to go home, to wash the filth from his body, put on clean, glorious clothes, hug his wife, and enjoy the simple, fleeting pleasures of his short, magnificent life. Eat the good food, drink the strong beer, dance in the streets of Uruk, and cherish the brief, magnificent spark of human existence. This was the gift, the only gift the gods had given him, and he was violently rejecting it. But Gilgamesh, his soul already consumed by the worm of Enkidu's corpse, could not listen. He was too deep in the tunnel of fear to turn back toward the light. He demanded the way to Utnapishtim, even if it meant crossing the dreaded, lethal waters of death itself. His refusal to accept the natural order made him both the greatest hero in history and the most tragically foolish man to ever walk the earth. He was choosing an impossible cosmic war over the peace of human acceptance. Gilgamesh did not ride out of Uruk as a conquering hero. He stumbled out as a haunted vagrant, wearing the ragged, filthy skin of a lion he had slain in his grief. The death of Enkidu was not merely a memory, it was a psychological stench clinging to his soul, a terrifying, visceral preview of his own inevitable decay. He had seen the maggots consuming his brother's flesh, and in that instant, the very foundations of his God-given confidence crumbled to dust. He, the mighty protector of Uruk, was just temporary meat, destined to become the same putrid earth as any commoner. This terror fueled a hysterical, desperate marathon sprint across the known world, driven by a primal need to outrun the shadow of the grave itself. He ran until his feet bled, until his lungs were fire, until the image of Enkidu's decomposing face was the only thing guiding him through the desert haze. His destination was a whisper spoken only by the oldest, most terrified priests, the farthest shore of the world, where the sun rises and sets, where the impossible man, Utnapishtim, was said to reside. Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of the great deluge, the only mortal man granted eternal life by the gods, held the secret Gilgamesh craved. But to reach this mythic ancestor, Gilgamesh had to enter the realm of true, primordial horror, the domain that mortals were forbidden to even glimpse. The first barrier was not a wall of stone or a desert plain, but a mountain range that kissed the very roof of the sky, the towering, impossible, catastrophic peaks of Mashu. This was no ordinary geological formation. This was the mountain where the sun god Shamash enters and exits the underworld every single day. It was literally the gateway between the living world and the cosmic mechanism of creation and destruction, a place defined by sheer, terrifying power. And guarding this catastrophic fault line were creatures born from the deepest corner of nightmare, the Scorpion Men. Their very existence was an affront to the natural order, massive, gleaming obsidian figures whose terrifying presence radiated a lethal, psychic aura that stopped the bravest man cold. Their gaze was death itself. Their tails arched lethally over massive, monstrous heads. They were not merely guards. They were the physical manifestation of the boundary between the mortal and the divine, created by the gods to ensure no human trespass occurred. When Gilgamesh, exhausted and half-mad, finally approached the gate, he saw them, two towering, impossible figures, male and female, guarding the deepest passage into the void. Any other man would have been instantly incinerated by the mere sight of their power, but Gilgamesh, possessing two-thirds divinity, was permitted a moment of confrontation. He stood before the gate, his lion skin stained with sweat and grime, and spoke his desperate truth. He was seeking Utnapishtim, the distant, impossible ancestor who held the secret of eternal life. The Scorpion Man's voice, described in the clay tablets as the sound of a gathering storm and the roar of 1,000 lions, echoed across the valleys, shattering the silence. They warned him that no mortal had ever passed through the mountain and survived. The journey inside was 12 leagues of absolute, suffocating darkness, the path the sun god took every night to traverse the underside of the world. It was a journey meant only for gods, and a step inside was to abandon light, air, and sanity. Yet the fear of death, the memory of his brother's rotten face, was a far greater torment than the certainty of temporary annihilation. Gilgamesh, driven by the impossible rage of his grief, plunged into the pitch-black tunnel. The darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a crushing, physical entity that grabbed him, suffocated him, and pressed down on his every nerve, seeking to crush his divine bloodline. For the first 3 leagues, he maintained a frantic pace, counting his steps, trying to cling to the memory of the sun. But by the 6th league, the horror of absolute sensory deprivation began to set in. He was running through the void, a place where time and space ceased to have meaning, where reality itself dissolved. His lungs burned, his muscles screamed, and his mind played tricks, convinced that the damp earth around him was not soil but the rotting remains of every soul that had tried and failed this passage before him. The tablets describe this passage as the ultimate test of psychological endurance, the final descent into madness. At the 9th league, his strength failed. He stumbled and fell into the mud, ready to give up, ready to embrace the darkness and allow the mountain to consume him. But the vision of Enkidu, now utterly corrupted and consumed by decay, flashed behind his eyes, reigniting the fire of his impossible, stubborn rage. He crawled forward on sheer willpower. Finally, after 12 leagues, a distance equivalent to traversing the ancient city of Uruk 12 times, he burst forth from the tunnel's mouth. The sight that greeted him was so shocking, so utterly alien to the harsh Mesopotamian desert he knew, that it threatened to break his sanity further than the darkness had managed. He had emerged into the garden of the gods. This was not a garden of earthly delights. This was a celestial landscape where every leaf, every branch, every piece of fruit was made of shimmering, perfect jewels. Lapis lazuli leaves, carnelian fruit, agate vines. A terrifying, untouchable paradise, so bright, so untouched by the ugliness of mortality, that it felt like a mocking illusion. This was the resting place of the sun, the perfect, immutable world that mortals could never truly belong to. And waiting within this breathtaking, terrifying grove was Siduri, the divine alewife, the keeper of the vine and the tavern of the gods. Siduri saw the ruined king emerging from the darkness, a magnificent figure reduced to a paranoid, fearful beast, and was instantly terrified. She recognized the desperation in his eyes, the stink of death on his lion skin, and she immediately slammed shut the gate to her tavern, sealing herself away from the raging god-man. Gilgamesh, having survived the scorpion men and the void, was not about to be stopped by a simple locked door. He roared, his voice shaking the jewel-encrusted branches, demanding to know the path to Utnapishtim. Siduri, speaking to him across the locked gates, offered him the oldest, most painful wisdom in human history, the very doctrine Gilgamesh had tried to burn down when he sought glory in Humbaba's forest. She looked at the King of Uruk, saw his wasted potential, and tried to talk sense into the hurricane of his grief. "Gilgamesh, where are you rushing?" she pleaded through the bolted gate. "The life you seek you will never find. When the gods created mankind, they allotted death to man, but life they retained in their keeping." She urged him to return home, to clean his filthy hair, to wear fresh clothes, to enjoy the simple, fleeting joy of being alive. She told him to fill his belly with good food, to hold his wife and child, to celebrate the festivals of the gods. This was the essence of Mesopotamian wisdom, acceptance of the natural cyclical order. But to Gilgamesh, this counsel was an intolerable, agonizing insult. It was a demand to surrender, a call to embrace the horror of decay he had witnessed in his beloved friend. He violently rejected her wisdom, accusing her of siding with the cosmic lie of mortality. He didn't want comfort. He wanted a weapon against the grave. He forced her, through sheer terror and persistence, to reveal the next, utterly lethal stage of his quest, the journey across the waters of death. This final expanse of ocean was the ultimate barrier. Not only were its waves treacherous, but the waters themselves were instantly lethal. A single touch meant instantaneous dissolution, eternal sleep. And the only ferryman who dared cross them, the boatman of Utnapishtim, was named Urshanabi. Gilgamesh was now standing at the very edge of reality, having passed the gatekeepers of the underworld and rejected the simple joy of the world of light. His rage and his fear had led him to the shore of the final, fatal ocean.